Hi, my name is Josh White, and this is Globalists, the new podcast from the battleground. This week, we're discussing Northern Ireland's anti migrant riot and how it connects with a trend of racist violence around the world. Joining me is my co host, Mitchell Plitnick.
Hey, Josh.
Hey, and now to quickly just revisit the timeline and what exactly has been going on for anyone who isn't up on this. It was a riot that lasted for about 2 days following a horrible incident in the north of Belfast, in which a man was attacked with a knife. It's been reported as a stabbing. It's sometimes talked up as a attempted beheading, but it was pretty grisly in terms of footage that was spread through social media. It went viral very quickly, and the usual suspects responded in kind online. Let's put it that way. In terms of political actors, there were quickly calls for a demonstration, for action, quote unquote, and there was violence soon after, but not no in the exact same part of the city, but in nearby neighborhoods and in the, I believe, the east of the city, if I'm not mistaken, which were predominantly Ulster Protestant areas. It's been described as a pogrom because the targets of the violence were migrants or anyone visibly foreign, including people who are now British citizens. People were forced from their homes in several cases. Buildings were set on fire. The police responded, but were ultimately too late or too ineffective to prevent the worst of it. And this went on for a couple of days, and now things have calmed down. And it obviously has a certain kind of resonance in these, what should we say, difficult times.
Yeah, it was. I think it's important to point out the way this sort of started was the person who was stabbed was white. The person who did the stabbing was a Sudanese immigrant, and when the police came, according to reports, they actually handcuffed the victim. And that was, I think, one of the things that the far right was able to seize on and say, look how unfair they are to us poor, disenfranchised white people. That they immediately think the victim was the aggressor. Now, there was a lot that apparently went on before that, and the details aren't clear. What is clear is, look, the incident itself could have been cause for criticism of the police and the way they handled it, but the response to it became something that had nothing to do with the incident itself. I think it was an excuse for a level of far right anti-migrant violence that we've seen in many places around the world, around especially around Europe and the United States in recent years. And that was stoked. And I think that's kind of for me anyway, as somebody who lives on the other side of the pond, that's kind of the really important point is people, especially people here. I mean, of course, Tommy Robinson, as you might guess, jumped on it immediately, and it feeds right into his narrative. So of course, he was going to do that. But another person whose narrative it feeds into is Elon Musk, and Musk took to Twitter and immediately just stirred the pot as much as he could. And this guy has millions of followers, so when he does that, it does have an effect. However much of a clown anyone may think Elon Musk may be, uh, more than that, it taps into, I think, something that is not discussed enough and not paid enough attention to, which is a kind of a worldwide loose network of these sort of far right gangs, if you will, um, that that do network and do communicate with each other across borders online through various online media, Telegram, and whatever other social media sites they might use. And quickly, this became something that was, I think, very difficult for police in Northern Ireland to contain. So yeah, it's an ugly incident, but I think it's also something that should be looked at in the context of a global move to sort of far right thuggery.
Definitely, definitely. What one point I should raise? I think you've conflated two cases actually. There was the Henry Novak murder case in Southampton, and that's the case where he was actually handcuffed. I don't.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
It's
sorry. I
okay.
got those confused, did I?
They happened extremely close. I think the Novak case. Well, no, the Novak case actually happened last year, but the release of the footage was roughly the
Ah,
same time, and the two things very much converged. But also, that did set off a far right riot. Well, a riot that was far right led in Southampton,
right,
and these
right,
two
right, right.
things basically
Yes,
crossed over.
and have
Um,
basically gotten confused in my mind. Yes.
I mean, it's yeah, looking at it from the US, it all looks very much mixed together. And to be fair, it is in a way, because the way it was spanned, especially on Twitter, I hate calling it X, was that this is violence against white people. This is being facilitated by the left, and the police are working against us, and all this stuff. Very much the two-tier policing narrative that's been on the agenda for the last 2 years or more, really, since Starmer came to power, and then you had the racist riots of 2024, again set off by a horrible, violent incident. Um, but we should absolutely get a bit more perspective in terms of the history here. Um, and in Northern Ireland, there's obviously a deep resonance in that the Catholic communities of Belfast recognised what the violence was because they'd been on the receiving end of this,
Mhm.
um, in large scale in the 1960s and the 1920s, but also smaller incidences down through the decades. If you talk to any Catholic Northern Irish person, many of them have a story about being forced out of their home, or someone they know who's been forced out of their home. Um, so even though there was definitely sympathy with kind of the anti-migrant narrative in those Catholic communities, I think it didn't get the same reaction because there's still this kind of divided cultural politics about these types of actions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that the despite the masks and the hiding of their identities, the rioters were loyalists. At least certainly on the whole. Who knows what each individual was, but I think that was, yeah, these are loyalist gangs. At the same time, it's a different um it's a different kind of phenomenon. At the same time as it's the same. I think at the battleground, John Foster wrote a very, very good piece, I think, about this that I recommend folks check out at thebattleground.eu. Um, it really speaks to the fact that the tendency towards this sort of thuggery by loyalist gangs is perhaps a carryover from the Troubles, as they're called. Um, but it's also a very, very different thing because the conflicts between Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland were obviously, based on long-standing historical issues of basically a kind of colonialism, a sort of British colonialism that took on religious aspects. We all know the history, and what's happening now is the loyalists who were at the time, the sort of in the colonizer role, if you will. They're now seeing a threat, or at least a perceiving a threat from migrants who are coming over to what they perceive as their land. There's an irony there that I think is worth kind of unpacking a bit, but it's also, I mean, there's also an almost absurd aspect to it, to this sort of far right nativist concept from people who are, by their very, ethnicity, the descendants of colonizers. I mean, you can go all over the world and, you go through Africa, you go through Asia, you see places with English names. Why do they have English names? They have English names because they were named after their British colonizers. These are the same people. And what we see today with this sort of white victimhood phenomenon that we see in Europe, we see it in the United States, is the idea that that position of power is threatened, even by people who maybe, it starts, I think, with people who maybe are feeling fairly comfortable in their positions in the world, and then see that their position of privilege might be threatened. This is a manifestation of the worst kind of that sort of backlash, and it's taking the form right now of anti-migrant rhetoric and anti-migrant violence, but it'll be directed at a great many quote unquote others. We're seeing that right now, I think, manifesting in UK politics.
Yeah, and there's been some talk of this in terms of it being a pogrom, as opposed to say just a riot or a specific a specifically anti-migrant outbreak of violence, but a specific sorry, but invoking the concept of pogroms from Eastern Europe, especially, has an obvious history around it. There's some discussion of this. I think it's a defensible term insofar as the kind of state authorities were at least ineffectual and unable to stop what was going on. It's still contestable because the violence wasn't so extreme that people were killed, thank God. Though it was extremely dangerous and people could have been killed. So I think you could call it an attempted pogrom or a proto pogrom, perhaps. But the wider issue here is that there seems to be a shift underway. Oh, did you hear a siren? Sorry.
Yeah, keep going.
Apologies. Um, the wider issue here is the trajectory that we're on. And it seems like the far right on the rise in Britain, the tendency towards this kind of violent action, albeit localized and containable, we've seen it again and again. We've had the big summer of racist rioting in 2024. We had incidents in Northern Ireland last year, and now again this year. It does seem, and we've also had the riot, the small riot in Southampton.
Mm-hmm.
There does seem to be a kind of trajectory here that's extremely worrying, and it's possible that there's a kind of pogromism emerging in Britain today, centered around reprisals to these horrible stories of violent crimes, effectively.
Yeah, I mean, I can say I take the term pogrom very personally, right?
Of course.
My family, I am a bit of an anomaly as an American Jew of my generation, in that none of my parents or grandparents were in the Holocaust. Um, they were all already here in the United States. All four of my grandparents were born in the United States, which is rare for an American Jew of my age. They came here fleeing. Their families came here fleeing the pogroms in Eastern Europe, and from various parts of Eastern Europe and Russia. That is how my family actually came here. So I certainly am somebody who would not want to trivialize that word. At the same time, I strongly resist this reluctance to draw what are clear historical parallels. And I think these kinds of ethnic ethnic riots are exactly are exactly pogroms, and there's nothing wrong with, I think, with calling them that. Um, and I think it's important that we do so because I think that carries a connotation to it that says it's unacceptable. Obviously, legally it's unacceptable, but also that it's socially and morally unacceptable. Um, that's something that we have historical basis for. So I think it's important, and I certainly think it qualifies as such. We are talking here about people who have, I mean, just never. We have your people who are coming to Europe or the United States from poverty, from war, most of which, frankly, have been caused at least, whether, immediately or over generations, by Western countries. And, are either remnants of colonialism or results of ongoing neoliberalism. All of these, or just of Western foreign policy of the last, post-Cold War era. Um, there's a responsibility here that I think people in the West don't want to take. People in Europe and the United States want to, who are so reluctant to allow migrants into their quote unquote their country, especially when you're talking about the United States. This idea about of being again, the irony literally drips out of it when you talk about the notion of defending this country from foreign invaders when this country was entirely built by foreign invaders, um, and used slavery to do it. The the irony is inescapable, but it's also uh, there's also, I think, a sense of class politics that's happening here because, and I think this is going back to John Foster's article. He talks about how that these uh, violent groups are seeded by a sense of marginalization, a sense of dispossession, largely based on the fact that economically they're not doing well. That is what happens there, which is one of the reasons that, as we were talking in the days leading up to this recording, we were talking about comparing it, I think, to Israeli settlers on the West Bank, and there's a difference there because uh, the Israeli settlers on the West Bank are motivated by a nationalism and a racism, but not by economic factors so much. I mean, they certainly want more land for for agriculture and for setting up, new industrial zones and et cetera, et cetera. There's economic benefits, but the settlers are not economically marginalized. They're economically supported by the state, um, and their existence is entirely at the expense of the Palestinians of the West Bank. Whereas in Belfast, for example, we're talking about groups of working class, largely working class Protestant white people. In the United States, a lot of the while a lot of the political power of the American right is derived from wealthy people or even just upper middle class people with who aren't super rich but are enough to have nice homes and etc. The foot soldiers, the voters, the people in rural America who have been, as far as they can tell, left behind by a neoliberal system, that they can either blame on the ultra rich who they can't really fight, they don't have the power, or they can blame on people of color and migrants who they can punch down on. And so, many naturally through this is a classic sense of racism, and I think it is exploited by a global far right movement. I think we go back to Steve Bannon, who saw an opportunity in Donald Trump to unite the global right, and it has worked despite Trump's personal failures. Elon Musk, as I mentioned, all of that I think is very real, and so it manifests in things like the Belfast riots that in the end also don't actually seem to harm the political right at all. In fact, they seem to help them.
Yeah.
When the protests here, you had a murder at a protest by a young, confused white nationalist of protesters who were protesting against the murder of George Floyd, black man who was killed by the police here. Um, you 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 had an enormous swell of support for him, and it was a great organizing tool for the right. And I think we're seeing that as well. In We're seeing it in UK politics with the rise not only of reform, but even more frighteningly of Restore UK, which is just an explicitly Nazi party.
Yes. There does seem to be a kind of cyclical aspect to this, which is uh, kind of radicalizing the political wing of these street movements, shall we say? Though we have to be careful that, of course, these political parties would officially disavow this kind of thing,
Sure.
while also kind of feeding off of it. Certainly, the kind of frisson of the riots, and the fact that, if we're honest, these are, for the participants, these are kind of scenes of revelry. It's not the case that it's simply just rage driving this. There's a kind of sick joy in these
Yeah.
moments of violence and clashing with the police and so on. Um, in terms of UK dynamics on reform and restore, it really does look like restore is the more radical of the two, and they are driving things at the moment in terms of the trajectory on the right, and the border between the previously marginal far right and the mainstream right is disappearing
Yeah.
amidst all of this violence.
Yeah, you have something like this that Restore can go out and cheer on, while Reform can say, well, we understand your grievance, but that's not the proper way to handle it when they're privately cheering it on. I think we've seen that, we see that dynamic here in the Republican Party. It's very, very similar. Um, it was sort of manifested itself with in the early days even of Donald Trump, when he was telling he was talking about a neo-Nazi party and talking about good people on both sides, both the neo-Nazi protesters and the anti-Nazi counter-protesters, saying that there are good people on both sides. That was something that followed him and was supposed to dog him. It was supposed to be something that was a political black mark for him, but it wasn't. It was quite helpful. And it helped him to consolidate his power in many, many ways. He did the same thing when he was challenged to tell the right wing fanatical group, the Proud Boys, uh, to
Yeah,
to to stop their agitation and their violence. And he said his phrase was "stand back and stand by." In other words, I'm telling you right now, hold on until I give you the word.
yeah,
Again, should have heard him. It doesn't. People who didn't like Trump before that reacted, screamed at it, and said, "Look what this is what we're talking about." And everybody else says, "Yeah, we know. We're good with it." That is how his supporters react, and I think we're seeing something very similar now with Nigel Farage. I've been watching since the riots in Belfast, 'cause I've had an interest in Northern Ireland since the 90s, precisely because of my interest in Israel Palestine,
of
because
course.
many people looked at it as a model for how Israel Palestine might be resolved. It hasn't worked that way, but for a variety of reasons that we could go into another time. But I've been following it for all that time, and so um, when I saw this sort of erupt, I wondered, is this some sort of manifestation of what was going on? Is this a return to that? And yeah, it really wasn't. It is something I think very new, that fed off of what was already kind of brewing in the loyalist community.
Mm. No, definitely. There's something playing out on the island of Ireland in a wider sense as well, because you've had anti-migrant protests and riots in the south of Ireland. Um, and there is definitely support for this kind of sentiment in Catholic communities as well. But it's especially in Belfast, it's definitely on a kind of it's on its own trajectory compared to the Protestant communities, I think. Um, and of course, that's historical and to do with sectarianism and the way the entity of Northern Ireland was set up. Um, what was heartening was that a few days after these terrible riots, is that you had a huge anti-racist demonstration in Belfast
Yeah.
that was a major show of strength for people who stand against this violence. And a lot of people also raised money and food and other supplies for the people who've been affected. So there has been a response. It's just whether or not that can be sustained, whether it will be enough over time. Because we keep having these what you might call kind of flash mob incidents, because it's
Yeah.
very much a digital or semi-digital phenomena.
Yeah. I think what concerns me is that I and it's not by any means a representative sample, but I've consistently seen people just, these sort of people on the street interviews um,
Mm,
in and around Belfast since the riots happened. And I've seen so many people, who are just talking about how horrible the riots were and how terrible they were, but also throwing in that we do have to do something about the migrants. We do. There are too many migrants. They're too dangerous, etc. Still repeating the same myths. That Nigel Farage has used to great effect. The idea that high housing costs are because of migrants, which is just demonstrably untrue. The idea that migrants are more violent or disposed to criminality, which is clearly untrue. I checked this before we did this show, and like in the U.S., migrants in the U.K. are statistically far less likely to commit crimes than citizens, than pre-existing citizens. This hysteria um, is something very real, and it goes beyond those who would support the actual violence. It's still these myths persist in people who are opposed to the violence, and that is what concerns me, because that is
yeah,
how politically there could be results down the road that that severely harm migrant people. We're seeing it. We've seen what happens, here in the United States. We've essentially gotten a special police force in ICE that acts, really similar to the Gestapo in terms of rounding up migrants, throwing them in prison for no other reason than who they are, and badly, brutally mistreating them, sometimes up to and including killing them.
yeah,
So, um, that dynamic still concerns me, even though I agree that, the response
yeah.
of saying that it's, that this violence is horrific and unacceptable and we have to stand against it has indeed been heartening.
Yeah. The response is perhaps necessary but not sufficient. Um, and I felt that the response to the Henry Novak response was particularly inept by the left and by anti-racist campaigners. They allowed the far right to swoop in and steal their positions on police violence and brutality and misconduct effectively. The Northern Irish case is somewhat different, but they are interconnected, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, I feel like I feel like the left is slightly stronger when it comes to Northern Ireland to some extent. Certainly internally to Northern Irish politics, there are people who can respond to this. People like Jerry Carroll of People Before Profit, who's been at the forefront of this response. Um, but yeah, it's extremely worrying, and I fear we will probably see more of this. I think that there's a kind of rising tide of low-level violence in Britain that's already far too normalized. Let's say we've had the well publicized incidents of attacks on synagogues and Jewish businesses and so on. Much less well publicized have been attacks on mosques and Muslim properties and individuals, Asian individuals. It's been on the rise for some time, and it's not really being talked about except when it comes to these major events.
And I think that's an important point because the fact that there have been attacks on synagogues, um, in some cases, here in the United States, and some that I'm aware of also in the UK, and elsewhere in Europe, sometimes they are done under the rubric of opposing the Gaza genocide, and I think some of those are misguided
Mm.
attempts to support the Palestinians. But I think for the most part, it's a cynical way of attacking Jews and making it look, socially acceptable. And in that regard, when we're talking about anti-Semitism, so that is obviously something that's apart from the anti-migrant hostility. Jews in most of these countries have been there for a while. They are not on the whole, migrants are not on the whole Jewish. There may be one or two here and there, but those communities are not do not have Jews in them, and yet anti-Semitism is rising with it. And I think that's where we can also draw the parallels with Israel, because this is all part of this sort of global populist right that that is being engineered by the likes of Steve Bannon, by the likes of Viktor Orban, by the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu, Vladimir Putin as well, by the way, who's often not mentioned in this cohort, but is
Yeah.
certainly somebody who supports this kind of politics. Whether or not he can be paying that much attention to it these days may be something that is a different question. But that's Russia's a part of that as well, as is Israel. And I think we should not miss the fact that the anti-migrant hostility is how it's mostly manifesting right now, because these are easy targets. It's a quote unquote low-hanging fruit. These are the most vulnerable communities. But this is a rise and a resuscitation of nationalist sectarianism that we're seeing throughout the Western and Western style, so that we can include Israel, world, um, that um, that legitimizes violence against marginalized communities, be they migrants, be they Palestinians, be they Jews in certain contexts. We've seen that before, and the relative affluence of Jews in the UK and the US compared to these other communities has never acted as a shield against this kind of sectarian violence. In fact, in some ways, it's the aggravating force. So um, this is something, I think that we need to get back to recognizing that all of these things are a manifestation of the global nationalist right. It's not about other political ideologies. Other political ideologies, such as, for example, Zionism, may feed into it. But ultimately, this is about white supremacy. Um, and it's about the same white supremacy and white ethno-nationalism that we saw in Europe 100 years ago, and we know the results.
Yes. And unfortunately, I fear that that history is fading rapidly. And it's partly why this stuff is happening, because it's kind of decoupled in the popular sense of the world today, that most people don't go around thinking of these kind of political movements and actions in the same way that they would have, say, even 40 years ago or 30 years ago. Um, if you look at the radical right groups and parties in Britain, they've almost all managed to decouple themselves from any kind of explicit kind of neo-Nazi symbolism or association, even though those elements are still there.
Hmm.
Um, they've managed to kind of decouple themselves while also ratcheting up the rhetoric and kind of embedding themselves in a kind of normie culture in many ways. Um, it's quite a disturbing success that they've had.
Yeah. When we see the when we see the rise of the AFD in Germany, we see the rise of Reform and Restore in the UK. We can also see in it the fact that, again, coming back to Israel, 30 years ago, Mayor Kahane was 35 years ago, whatever it was, Mayor Kahane was kicked out of the Knesset for being a racist. Today, the Knesset is dominated by Kahanists, be they in the Likud or be they in the Otzma Yehudit, the Jewish Power Party, or the Jewish Home Party. The people who are exercising the most influence are essentially following Kahanist ideology, and that's become acceptable. You just don't call it, you just don't call it Kahanist. You just don't invoke that symbol. You don't invoke in Europe. You don't invoke the swastika. You do it under a different name, and that is what we have now. And I remember growing up, there would be, these parties were existing, but they were always marginalized and most of all recognized for what they were. They're not recognized for what they are, even by people who recognize them as far right. They're not
Yeah,
recognized as fascist, and I think that's a major concern.
yeah, absolutely. Even using the term far right is increasingly denormalized in the discourse, in mainstream discourse. It's kind of it's raised, and then people kind of scoff at it or say, "Ah, it's ridiculous. What are you talking about?" And that is a terrible cultural shift,
Yeah,
which is enabling all of this.
yeah. We'll have to look into that. Also into the idea that more mainstream so-called centrist parties like the Democrats here and Labor in the UK, how they
Yeah.
feed into that. But that is, I believe, our next discussion next week. So
Yes, not to preempt it too much. That's all for this week. Thank you for listening. This has been Globalists.